Hey, greetings and welcome to week 7. And I don't know which lecture this is going to be. This is the first of what could be a couple, or we may just look at one extended lecture. I'm going to wait and see how this plays out as I take us through what I want to take us through this week. So, last week we looked at the spiritual practices. We've been taking an in depth look into who we are as leaders. How we ensure that we're leading out of our authentic self, how we're navigating self-care, coming to terms with the imposter that is at work in our lives. And I wanted to talk a little bit about success and shame this week, but I want to do so within the context of one particular story of the scripture. And I want to use this story of scripture to sort of reframe how you and I understand maybe something about our calling, about how our calling works itself out, about the impact of success in our calling, and then ultimately how success can actually sabotage us and move us into a shame cycle, but then how God intervenes in that shame cycle and calls us out of it. So the story that I want to look at is out of First Kings, and it's chapters really 17, 18, 19, 20. I'm not going to go through all 4 chapters, of course. I'm not going to read everything to you, but it's a story of Elijah. And as we navigate this story, I want us to look at the way in which Elijah's story unfolds. So we know at this time of Elijah that the nation of Israel has been divided into 2 nations, the northern and the southern, the northern being the 10 tribes of what's called Israel, and the southern being the 2 tribes of Judah. And if you read Kings, you'll come to realize that there's definitely a perspective in which Kings is being written, one that is highly favored of the southern kingdom over the northern kingdom. And you'll come to realize that as you read Kings, that the way in which it paints and portrays the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, in a very corrupt manner. So you'll see something like they did evil in the eyes of God and caused others to do likewise. It's sort of a repetitive theme over and over again, or he did worse than the one who had come before him. So in that, at one point in their story, a king by the name of Ahab emerges, who marries Jezebel. Some of us who are familiar with the scriptures are familiar with that story. But it's Elijah's moment in this story that I think I want to spend a little bit of time talking about for these lectures. And so Elijah's story emerges in the context of Ahab's leadership. And there's a call upon Elijah's life to speak truth to power. Now, I think at some level, all of us have, at some level, that calling. It's that idea of we are called to do justice, right? And to recognize where things are askew from God's intended plan, and to be able to give voice to those moments when we get a call and a question power. And yet, I want to speak more blandly about just the nature of calling, without really honing into his specific calling. Though I think his specific calling is this call to stand in the midst of power and speak truth to it. But calling in of itself demands some things. It demands boldness, courage, humility. We talked about some of these things, resilience and fortitude. And these are the characteristics that I think are being fleshed out in Elijah's story. And so as Elijah is called to go and stand in the face of this corrupt king, we pick up his story in 17. It says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishba in Gilead said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word.'" And so he speaks that, but then I want us to follow on what comes next. "Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, 'Leave here, turn eastward, and go hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You'll drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you food there.'" So here it is, and I think this is important for us to understand, that Elijah operates or acts out of a sense of faithfulness. He does what he's called by God to do. And the reward for that is scraps, fed by ravens and drinking from a brook. And so I think this is important for us to understand, that just because we're faithful, and as leaders, we need to recognize this, that our faithfulness does not guarantee a sense of material abundance, right? Or in any way that means, whether it's attendance or the growth of our ministry or finances or even our own personal provision. Faithfulness to the call doesn't mean that we're going to be blessed in those manners. I mean, he's blessed, he's taken care of, but he's fed scraps from the ravens. So he did what the Lord told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And so he's living into God's faithfulness. He's living into God's provision. But it's the next line that I want us to listen to here for a moment. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Now, this is an important moment, and I think this is important for us to understand as leaders. So here's Elijah. He's operating out of a sense of faithfulness to God. He's stepping into and leaning into his calling. He's been faithful to what God has led him to do, and it's put him in this Kerith ravine. And imagine at first he's going to the brook, and he's able to gather hands full of water to drink from. In our terms, maybe he would have had a cup and he could slosh it in there and drink till his heart was content. But over the course of time, he began to realize that there was less and less water. He's literally watching the brook dry up right in front of his eyes. He's where he's supposed to be because that's where God has sent him. And yet he's watching the brook dry up. Instead of sloshing the cup in and drinking to his heart's content, now he has to pull a bit of the dirt away to create a little bit of a pocket to gather just enough water so he can just scoop the cup in just a little bit to just get just enough. But there's this sense that in the midst of this moment, that he's going through a sense of what Robert Clinton has called an integrity check, a moment in which we're forced to reckon with: will we remain faithful even when the brook dries up? Will we remain faithful even when things get difficult, when things become challenged, when things don't work out or operate in the manner that we had hoped that they would or that we intended that they would? This becomes a question for all of us who do ministry, because it's in those moments when the brook begins to dry up that the voices in our head begin to move and say, maybe you got it wrong, maybe you're not supposed to be here. If God really was going to bless you, surely there would be enough water for tomorrow. And the call of God upon our lives requires the fortitude and the emotional resilience to stand in those moments when the brook is drying up, knowing that you know that you've been called to that moment in that place, and that the God who has given us the brook is the God who will provide even when the brook is dried up. And so there's going to be moments in your ministry when you're going to do what God has called you to do, and people won't show up. Things won't grow. And in those moments, you have to realize that God is forming and shaping your faith. Now, I know when we talk about Elijah's story, we immediately want to move to Mount Carmel. The moment in which he stands in front of all of the prophets of Baal and he calls down fire from the heavens and it burns up the sacrifice. We want to go there. And when I talk to leaders, I find myself talking to people who want to go from the moment in which they were called to the mountaintop where they can call down fire. But no one arrives at the mountaintop unless they've made their way through the Kerith ravine, unless they've learned to stay steady in the midst of the dry, weary moments when it feels like everything that you thought it was going to be, it's not. And will you be resilient and resolved and have enough fortitude to stand in there and to remain even when there's no getting to the mountaintop without a Kerith ravine. And for many of us, that Kerith ravine will be the testing point of whether we stay in what we're called to or whether we go and move on beyond where we are. Now, there's another beautiful moment here that in the midst of this Kerith ravine and the brook drying up, God then says, I'm going to send a widow to you, and she's going to feed you. Now the widow is coming out to gather just enough so that she can prepare one last meal for her and her son to eat it, and then she says, we're going to just lay down and die. And Elijah said, no, cook me some, and God will provide. And she does, and the next morning we know the story. There's flour and there's oil. And I think what this says is that when you and I endure through our Kerith ravine, when we stay steady and we stay faithful, even when everything is drying up around us, others get caught up in our story of faith. That's the impact that we can have as leaders. That's why fortitude, resilience is so important, because the witness of our lives in the difficulty of the Kerith ravine will ultimately wrap others into our story and invite them to become participants. And their faith is increased as they navigate their own seemingly empty jars, only to watch God be faithful and provide and take care of those needs. And so in this first lecture, I wanted us to hear the story about how the calling begins when we step out in boldness and courage, when we listen to God and recognize that even in listening to God, things don't always work out the way we had hoped or anticipated. Things aren't always as lavish and abundant as we thought that they might be if we just did what God told us. Sometimes we do what God tells us, it lands us in a ravine with a dry brook. But will you, because you've heard the voice of God, stay true, stand steadfast, and remain conscious of your emotional fortitude, of whether you are resilient enough to endure the hardship of a dry brook, knowing that the God who provided the water in the first place will be the God who provides whatever is to come next.